Earlier in this course, we took a look at the final fight as it was cut together by director Lin O-Ding and his crew. I had mentioned that we'd be looking at how it was edited and then cutting our own version of it. I'd like to show you my version of the fight scene that I'll be teaching you how to recreate. You'll notice that the scene is edited together in largely the same way, but it has a number of variations that give it a bit of a different feel. Take a look.
You got our money now, just leave us alone.
Get in the fucking warehouse, motherfucker. Now. Wait. Hey, oh.
Leave her alone! Motherfucker! What? Get him! Come here!
Alright, so let's move on to a bit more of the editing prep work as we continue to get ready for the editing process. Coming up, we're going to meet the cast of characters involved in the fight scene and learn a little bit more about each one. See you in a bit. Earlier in this course, we talked about the importance of character development to give our fight scene a bit more weight, since we'll know and care about the characters a bit more that way. We've already had a chance to watch this entire film in a previous lesson, but I want to go back and take another quick look at the characters involved. Alright, so our story involves 5 people, divided into 2 groups. The first group is a man and a woman, and the second group consists of 3 thugs. Let's meet the individual players. The boyfriend's name is Dan. He seems like a pretty nice guy, and definitely somebody worth rooting for. And here's the girlfriend. Her name is Erica. In the film, their conversation is pretty lighthearted, and they both seem like generally well-balanced, nice people. Neither of them comes off aggressive or unlikable, at least not to me. These 2 characters are definitely our good guys. It's not yet clear to the viewer which one of them is the protagonist or hero, but we're basically already in support of both of them and care at least a little bit about their welfare by the time we get to the fight. The second group of people, however, is basically the opposite. First, we've got Mouth, appropriately named because he never stops talking. The next member of the crew is Rollins. He serves as a bit of muscle on the street. And then we've got TT. He's the group leader. The 3 guys in this group are pretty shady looking, and they come off seeming pretty angry and on edge. The character Mouth, reading out of The Art of War, seems to be both a little unintelligent and hyperactive at the same time, which, in my experience, is almost always a recipe for disaster. It seems like a safe bet that these guys are probably looking for trouble, but again, the viewer doesn't know too much about them yet, like exactly what they're capable of or how dangerous or evil they might be. These guys, though, are certainly our antagonists. Alright, so now that we know who's who, we can start analyzing the fight structure itself. In the next lesson, we're going to watch the master shot of the fight scene and deconstruct the choreography of the fight into individual moves. See you in a bit. Before we can really start editing together our fight scene, we need to have a solid understanding of exactly how it's supposed to flow. Often, the director will shoot a wide master shot, and this will be our guide. So, what is a master shot? A master shot is a film recording of an entire dramatized scene from start to finish from an angle that keeps all the players in view. It is often a long shot and can sometimes perform a double function as an establishing shot. So in the case of this fight scene, our master shot will show the actors or stuntmen perform the whole fight from start to finish in one continuous take. And lucky for us, the director filmed 3 master shots, all from slightly different camera angles and distances. I'm going to load up one of these shots from scene 10E take 1, which you can find at the very beginning of camera roll A17. In this shot, the fight is actually being performed by 4 stuntmen instead of the actual actors. Now, we're going to break down the fight by listing out the key moments and actions in the order in which they occur. We'll refer to this list as our beat sheet. A beat sheet will do 3 things for us. First, it's going to provide the outline of the fight and serve as a sort of roadmap to help guide us as we're editing the fight together from all the different takes and angles later on. Second, the beat sheet is going to help us make sure that we respect the choreography and we're staying true to the fight as it was originally designed by the stunt choreographer. This is almost always a good idea because those guys are the real experts and they know exactly how they intended for the scene to flow. It's our task as the editor to do a good job telling the non-verbal story they've designed through the choreography of the fight. And third, the beat sheet is going to prevent us from getting overwhelmed. Once we start editing and getting really involved in putting the fight together, it's common to feel a little lost or confused, trying to keep track of all the events that are happening and trying to keep everything moving in the right direction and in the right order. Being overwhelmed can lead to sloppy editing, as we try to just get something done quickly because it seems like too much to deal with otherwise. The beat sheet is going to help us stay focused on each step one at a time and on the editing process itself, since we won't have to be mentally keeping track of everything else that's coming up next. As we go through each moment, I'd recommend that you grab yourself a few things. First, a piece of paper and a pencil to write down these moments so you can refer to them later. Or, alternatively, you can print them out from a simple choreography beat sheet that I typed up. The file is called mastershot_beatsheet.txt, and you can find it in the Lesson Resources folder and the subfolder for this lesson, Analyzing the Master Shot. Now, this master shot is picking up after the initial confrontation between the thugs and the couple. Dan and Erica have been told to get into the warehouse, and the tension is pretty high at this point. So, just to make sure that we're all clear about who's here in this group, we have Rollins here on the far left. Then we have TT. Here you can see Erica's face over TT's shoulder. Next is Dan. And finally, there's Mouth on the far right. All right. So let's run through the key moments of the fight. Starting at the beginning, we have Dan grabbing Rollins' wrist. Then, as Dan looks back at Erica, Rollins sucker punches him. Dan punches back. TT kicks Dan in the stomach. And punches Dan to the ground. Next, Erica is thrown to the ground. Then we see the thugs kicking Dan as he's on the ground. Alright, so then Dan somehow knocks TT down, though in this master shot, it's a little hard to see exactly how he does it. Dan then follows up with an uppercut and hits Mouth. Then we have TT, who's back up off the ground now, as he kicks Dan in the back onto the ground. Then TT picks Dan up. Dan breaks TT's elbow, or at least locks it up somehow. Then Dan hits TT and throws TT to the ground. Alright, so next we have a bit of a scuffle between Dan, Mouth, and Rollins. And to keep it simple, I'm just going to write Dan attacks Mouth. And Dan attacks Rollins. Then TT's back up again and grabs Dan from behind. Dan escapes and he knees TT in the face. So at this point, you can see that the fight continues for a couple more moves, and then the director calls for the action to stop, and he asks the stuntmen to reset.
Go back on top, please. Go back. Reset.
You can see that they go through pretty much the same moves for another take, even though it's not reslated as one. The director calls reset again, and we pick back up around the point where Dan was kneeing TT in the face. So let's just continue from there and see what else happens in the fight. Okay, so after the knee, Dan fights with Rollins and Mouth a bit more. And it's a little chaotic, so we're just going to keep the description vague for now. The next key moment, though, is when Dan flips Rollins onto the ground. Then we have TT back up off the ground again. I guess he's a pretty resilient guy. And he punches Dan. Now, a quick note here. I know from watching the final film and having worked with the rest of this footage already that the first attack that TT throws here to Dan isn't actually a punch. He's pretending to hit Dan over the head with an empty bottle. In the other shots of this part of the fight, we'll see footage of that actually happening, and we'll work it into the scene. But for now, we'll stay true to this process of going through the master take, and we'll just leave the description as is, with punches and kicks. Alright, so next we have TT kicking Dan a bit more. Dan blocks the kicks. Then Dan punches TT twice. And Dan does a spinning hook kick to TT's face. And that's it. That's the end of the fight. So, watching and analyzing this master shot has really given us a solid overview of how this fight scene is supposed to flow. You'll find that watching a master shot in any genre of editing can help you really get quickly familiar with a scene and start developing a good plan for editing it. If you took notes of the various stages of this fight, hang on to those because you're going to need them later. If you didn't, you'll definitely want to print out a copy of the text file we supplied and keep it handy. Coming up in the next lesson, we're going to dive into the raw footage and start arranging all of our shots using subclips. See you in a bit. In this lesson, we'll be going through each of our camera rolls and using subclips to organize the footage by scene and take. This is an important step in the process of editing any type of scene, since it's a really powerful way to give us quick access to every shot contained in the footage without having to scrub through large sections of material to find what we need. Taking the time to organize your footage like this at the beginning of a project is very important, but I'll admit that it's also a bit of work and it takes some time. However, rather than tell you all the reasons why you should take the time to organize your footage, let me tell you what will happen usually if you don't. So, what happens if I don't organize my footage? Well, for starters, you'd probably encounter a lot of frustration. If we were to try to just start cutting together the footage into our scene right away, it'd be really frustrating trying to find the shots that we need. We'd have to manually look through all the footage each time we needed a specific scene or take, and that gets old really fast. Trust me, I've tried it before, and it wasn't fun. Second, you'd miss good shots and takes. It's really easy to scrub over footage quickly and not notice the really great delivery of a line, or a well-executed punch, or an emotionally powerful facial expression. If you're missing the opportunities to include these moments and shots in your cut, because your footage isn't organized, you're not creating the best version of the scene from the material that you have to work with. Then you end up with a mediocre cut that doesn't do any good for your film or for your reputation as an editor. The third thing that will almost definitely happen if you don't spend the time to properly organize your footage early on is that you'll just simply slow down the editing process by a lot. Ultimately, the time you'll lose having to look for shots in a huge pile of disorganized footage will waste more time than you saved by not organizing everything in the first place. Alright, so hopefully I've convinced you of how important this is. And trust me when I tell you that taking the time to organize your shots and prepare for editing is just as important as knowing how to actually cut together the footage. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. You'll want to open up your camera roll bin as well as your scene 10 bin. We'll be going through the camera rolls one by one and subclipping out each shot into the scene 10 bin and labeling them with a scene and take number. Let's go through a few examples and I'll show you what I mean. For now, don't try to follow along, just pay attention to what I'm demonstrating, and then you'll be able to do the same thing with your footage yourself at the end of the lesson, and that's going to be part of the homework assignment. Alright, so we're just going to go through a couple simple examples here. So we'll start with camera roll A14. And that's not necessarily the order that you should go in. You should just probably start at the beginning and just head all the way through. But I'm just going to kind of pick and choose a couple of these different scenarios that present different obstacles or different ways of breaking these things down, just so you can see a variety of the different situations that you might encounter. So camera roll A14. Now I've already pre-marked where each of the slates are. Obviously the footage won't come that way for you. I just did that for us, so it's a little bit easier for me to kind of find this stuff and show you where it is, and it doesn't take too long. Alright, so pretty simple. Head to the top of your first slate, go ahead and mark it in, scrub through till you find the end of this take. And so that's the beginning of the next take, take 2. So we'll go ahead and mark it out right before it. And then, you know, obviously with each program, you're going to subclip differently. With Avid, you can either drag it in, drag it out of your source monitor and it'll create a subclip, or you can use a hotkey. I have mine set up for Shift S, but obviously your mileage may vary depending on your software. All right, so we dragged the subclip of the first take into our scene 10 bin. And now I'm just going to label it by scene and take. So we're going to label it 10B, that's the scene, -1, that's the take. And save. And that's pretty much the process. So I'm just going to do a couple more here from this particular shot. This is take 2, you can see. Scrubbing through. And there's take 3. So we'll back up a little bit, mark it out, drag it in, 10B, take 2. So pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at something from the B camera. So camera roll B4. All right, so you can see here, it's actually dual slated, but I've kind of looked through the footage already, and I know this is more than likely from the B camera, so that's why it's labeled as such. Scene 10D, take 1. Mark it in, go to the end of this particular take. And obviously you can see that I have not pre-marked this shot. All right, so here's the beginning of the next take. Let's take 2. So back up a little bit, drag it in. Now what was it? It was 10D, take 1. So 10D, take 1. All right, moving on. Take 2, mark it in, scrub through. Now, here's a point. I'm just kind of scrubbing, you know, using my mouse. Sometimes you'll find that it's kind of jumping too quickly, so you run the risk of you know, missing the slate and not actually seeing where it is. So there's a couple ways that you can handle that. You can be really thorough, and you can just play through the entire scene. Or you could play it double time. And that'll usually be a little bit smoother, and you'll kind of run less of a chance of skipping over the slate. Another thing that you can do if your software has this, if like a jog function, perhaps, Final Cut Pro has a couple different like jog wheel simulators, and you can just kind of drag it and jog through the footage at faster than normal speed, but not necessarily quite as fast as if you're just jerking your mouse around and possibly missing things. The other thing that you can do is you could actually drag your window larger. And obviously by doing that, it's going to make your bar here a lot larger. So you're going to have a finer increment of movement as you scrub through it. And again, it'll make it less likely that you'll skip over slates. All right, now let's look at one last example here. This is down in camera roll B12. Now, the reason I want to show you this example is because this is a situation where the scene was not actually slated at the head. So you can see here at the very beginning, there's no slate, yet obviously, there's some action beginning here. And then you come to this right here, this upside down slate. When you come to an upside down slate, many of you probably already know this, but for those of you that don't, it means that it applies to the footage that came prior to it. So this is actually scene, if you can kind of turn your head upside down, it's scene 10AJ, take 1. And it pertains to this footage right here. So if you're not going to see that too much in the course of this project, but you'll see it a couple times, namely in this particular camera roll. But anyway, so it's scene 10AJ, take 1. So once you figure that out, scene 10AJ, take 1, done. And then you move forward a little bit. And then you can see actually the next shot is slated at the head, as it should be. Scene 10AJ, take 2. All right, so I'm going to stop here. You can see how the process works, so I'm just going to show you what your bin should look like after you finish going through and subclipping all of the footage. You'll notice that there are a few situations where I have subclips with the same name. That's because one is a take from the A camera and one is a take from the B camera. We could add camera information to the subclip names to differentiate between the two, but in our case, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to add actual descriptions about each, specifically the camera distance, like long shot, medium shot, and so on. We'll be doing that in the next lesson though, so you don't have to worry about that right now. The whole subclipping process took me about an hour, so it does take a bit of time, but that's editing for you. And like I said before, when it comes to editing, preparation is just as important as the actual process of cutting. If you want to do things right and cut great scenes, you have to do the prep work. Or at least you have to hire an assistant to do it for you. But since we don't have an assistant for this project, we're kind of on our own. So that brings us to our homework assignment for the lesson. Before moving on to the next lesson, you'll need to go ahead and finish subclipping all of the footage. As you do this, you'll actually be accomplishing more than just getting your footage organized and ready to work with. You'll be starting to get really familiar with the footage, and you're going to start seeing some of what it has to offer once it's time to start cutting. Take your time with this. Like I said earlier, it's a bit of work, so if you need to work on it for a little bit, take a break, pick it back up. Just make sure that you finish it up before moving on to the next lesson. Coming up in the next lesson, titled Organizing Your Bin, we're going to take a look at all the different subclips and add a bit more descriptive information to them, like notes about the camera distance, the people in the shot, and what parts of the fight are covered in that shot as it relates to the beat sheet. See you in a bit. Alright, so in the last lesson, we spent some time subclipping out all the takes individually and labeling them according to scene and take in our bin. Your homework was to finish subclipping the rest of the takes. If you haven't done that yet, go ahead and hit pause while you finish it up, since you'll need everything subclipped and ready to go to move forward into this lesson. Okay, so now it's time to organize the footage in our bin a little bit more by adding some descriptive information to our shots. This is what our bin's going to look like after going through this lesson. Now, the fight scene we're cutting is all from scene 10 of the film, so we ended up putting all the clips in the same bin. But since there are a bunch of different setups, distances, angles, and sections of this scene, it's important that we make note of that information. What we're going to do in this lesson is go through the takes in our bin and add a bit of metadata to each clip. We'll be adding 3 pieces of information for each clip. The first piece of info is going to be the type of shot it is. So close-up, medium close-up, long shot, and so on. The second piece of info will be which characters are in the shot. And the third will be a couple comments about the action that occurs in the shot. Alright. So the first thing we're going to want to do is open up the Scene 10 bin. And I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of some of these extra columns because we're not going to really use all this information when we're looking at our clips to find, what the shot actually contains and who's in it and the length and the action going on. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose to hide all of these extra columns in my bin. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create 3 new columns here. First column I'm going to create is going to be called shot. Second column we're going to call character. And third column we're going to call comments. All right. Let's get this into place. All right. Now the shot column is going to basically contain the description of the actual type of camera shot it is. So the length of the shot, extreme long, medium shot, close up, extreme close up, and so on. The character column is going to just describe simply the characters that are featured prominently in the shot. And the comments column is going to basically describe what's going on in the shot. So we're going to just kind of go through this list. I'm going to cherry pick out a few of them, and we're just going to start by describing the shot and the characters. And we'll do that for a few, and then we'll come back and we'll do the comments after that, because I want to talk a little bit more about the comments. There's some important information I kind of want to go over before we get into that. So let's start with scene 10, take 2. And you can see it's shot on the A camera. And it looks like we have a pretty long shot here. I'd say it's probably actually an extreme long. So that's what we'll call it. EX long. All right. And then under characters, you got Dan here and you got Erica. And in the foreground, you got some of the thugs, but they're not featured prominently. They're not really the focal point of the shot. So we're not going to put them in the characters column for this. So we'll just write Dan. And I like to do character space slash space character space slash space. That's just the way I like to do it. You can do it however you want. Just be consistent, though, so that it's easy to alphabetize a little bit later on. So I'm going to do Dan space slash Erica. All right, cool. Let's check out these two here. So these are both scene 10 take 3s. So obviously one is from the A camera and one is from the B camera, because this is only a 2-camera shoot. So it looks like this one is probably a long shot. Yep, from the B camera. And this one will probably be from the A camera. That is a similar shot length to the one that we already saw from an A camera. And it is. It's another extreme long. So we'll just copy and paste that part. And this one from the B camera is probably a long shot. So we'll call that a long, also featuring Dan and Erica. Copy and paste. All right, easy enough. Moving on. Let's check out scene 10 AD, take 1. And, I should point out, you don't need to follow along right now. I'm just going to kind of go through some of these examples, and then your homework after this course or this lesson's over is going to be to go through everything in this bin and enter in all of this information on your own before you move on. So for now, just pay attention, and if you want to take some notes, but it's pretty simple, so I'm sure you'll be able to just kind of remember what we're doing here. All right, so scene 10 AD, take 1. All right, so an A camera version and a B camera version, which you can tell by our burn-in, and also, well, the slate's a dual slate, so the only way you can tell right now is by our burn-in. All right, so one of them is a little bit tighter than the other, it looks like. So we're going to call, we'll call this top one a medium close-up as far as length goes. And then the one from the B camera, we'll call that a medium. All right. Now, let's see who's in the shot. We got TT, we got Dan. Who else do we got? We got Mouth right here. And it looks like we got Rollins too. So we got pretty much everybody except for Erica, because she's been already thrown on the ground, and that's kind of where she hangs out for most of the fight. So you don't have to worry too much about figuring out if she's in part of the mix, because usually it's these 4 guys. So, all right. So what was the orders here? So we'll talk about, we'll list down TT. and Dan, and then it was Mouth and Rollins. All right. And this shot will be the same. Because it's the same exact, remember, it's the same exact take, just with a different camera. So everything will be identical, but from another angle. So we can copy and paste that. All right. Let's look at a couple more. All right. Now in these two, we got scene 10 a.m., take 1, and scene 10 a.m., take 2. Shot from only one camera, from the B camera. And they're basically just reaction shots of Erica as she kind of sits on the sideline and reacts to the fight. So we'll call the shot, we'll call the shot a medium close. Medium close up. And the character, the only character, is Erica. And we'll copy and paste that. All right, let's check out some more. All right, let's look at, actually, you know what? Let's look at scene 10K, take 1. One from an A camera, one from a B camera. All right, so here's the A, and here's the B. So we'll start with the A. All right, so this is a little bit wider than the other one. You can see that the B camera version is probably a medium close, whereas the A camera version is a medium. So we'll list them like that. Medium and medium close up. All right. And as far as the characters in the shots, I guess we'll start with Dan since he's the first one kind of making a move in the shot. So we got Dan, Mouth, and TT for sure. And anybody else? Does Rollins make a appearance? He does not. All right, so Dan, Mouth, and TT. Great. All right, copy and paste. And we'll check out just one more. Well, one more shot. 2 more clips. Scene 10M, take 1 from A and B cameras. All right, here's the A camera. And here's the B camera. Again, it's medium and medium close-up. Medium for A. Medium close-up for B. All right, so now on A, characters involved are Dan, Rollins. He's always got the hoodie, the full hoodie. And then you got TT. So Dan, Rollins, TT. And then just a little bit of, this is just basically follow through action with Rollins again, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But yeah, so characters involved pretty much, yes, Dan, Rollins, and TT. So we'll list it like that. Dan, Rollins, and TT. And copy and paste. All right, so that's pretty much the process there. Now, before we add the comments about the action taking place in the clip, there's a few things I want to point out. More often than not, you'll find that there's a good deal of improvisation going on during a fight scene, or any action scene for that matter. Most of it will be planned out and choreographed pretty meticulously, but inevitably, while filming the actual scene, good ideas will pop up or problems will become obvious, so the choreography will have to be tweaked a little bit. For that reason, certain parts of this fight may sometimes be filmed out of logical order, and so the scene and take numbers and letters won't necessarily guide us straight through the scene in a perfectly straight line. We're going to need to watch through the different takes of the fight and figure out which actions are being covered in each take, where they fit into the progression of the fight, and then mark that down in the comments for each clip. I like to use a bracketing system for commenting on this type of action, just for my own notes. So what I'll do is find the first event that takes place in the take, then the last event, and I'll write down just those 2 things, separated by a hyphen. You'll find that even though there were some variations from the beat sheet that we created by watching the master shot, most shots will correspond pretty closely to what we expect to see, and will somehow fit into the overall picture. I'm going to walk you through on how to take notes and comment on a few of these takes, and then I'll leave you to finish up the rest on your own. All right, so let's just start with the first clip, and we'll just we'll add the action bracketing for each of the clips that we've already started labeling with shot and character information. So we'll start with scene 10, take 2. All right. This one's pretty simple. We're just gonna call this Thugs Approaching Couple. Easy. Thugs Approaching Couple. And these are all gonna have the same description. So we'll just copy and paste that to keep it identical. All right, so that's easy. Let's move on to scene 10 AD, take 1. All right, here it gets a little bit more complicated. Now we actually have to start kind of paying attention to the beats of the fight so we can kind of categorize and segment what's going on here. Dan throws TT. So on our beat sheet here, you can find right here, Dan throws TT to the ground. So that's what just happened. And then we have Dan attacking Mouth and fighting with Rollins as well. All right, and looks like that's pretty much the end of the take, but they just reset without reslating. So we'll probably see those two or that group of actions again. So we'll probably see him throw TT and then fight with Mouth and Rollins again. All right, so that's what's going on there. All right, so we have the actions of these shock brackets are Dan throws TT to the ground, Dan attacks Mouth, Dan attacks Rollins. So what we're going to write in the comments here, we're going to write Dan throws TT hyphen attacks Mouth and Rollins, and that should give us a really solid description of what's going on there and kind of bracket the action like we talked about. So Dan throws TT hyphen, we'll say Dan again. Dan attacks Mouth / Rollins. And obviously the B camera will contain the same action. So we can copy and paste that. Okay. And let's see. This is simple. Erica reactions. Done. Erica reactions. That's easy. What else we got? Okay, we got some more action. So let's see. This looks like where Dan's going to uppercut Mouth. Yep, so Dan uppercuts Mouth. So where's that on our beat sheet? Right here. Dan uppercuts Mouth. And then TT kicks Dan in the back, picks Dan up, Dan locks up his arm and throws him to the ground, and then starts fighting with the guys again. So Dan uppercuts Mouth, TT kicks Dan in the back onto the ground, TT picks Dan back up, Dan breaks his elbow and throws TT to the ground and then attacks Mouth again. That's the action that takes place in this particular shot. So we're going to write this as Dan uppercuts Mouth hyphen Dan throws TT to the ground. And the reason I'm not going to include Dan attacks Mouth at the end of this is because that's more of just a follow-through motion, just for the sake of keeping the filming thorough and the action continuous in the choreography. But the last main action that's highlighted in this is where he throws TT to the ground. So you can label it differently if you want, but for my purposes, I'm going to say it's Dan uppercuts Mouth through Dan throws TT to the ground. Dan uppercuts Mouth to Dan throws TT. And I'm not going to write to the ground just because I'm kind of running out of bin space, and I know what Dan throws TT means, so we're just going to leave it like that. These are just notes for you, so if you can have your own shorthand and remember what things mean, then that's perfectly fine. And then the B camera, obviously, same description. Okay, so scene 10M, take 1. All right, so what we got here? Dan's fighting with Rollins. TT grabs Dan. Dan knees TT in the face and then goes back to fighting. Again, this is more of a follow-through motion because it's not even really finished in the shot here. All right, so let's see. It was Dan attacks Rollins. TT grabs Dan from behind. Dan escapes and knees TT in the face, and then Dan. We actually have Dan punch his mouth that was in the master shot. So again, this is just more follow-through action. Really, though, this should be mouth according to their master shot. So this is kind of strange that it would be Rollins. But I doubt we're going to use this piece of footage anyway, so I don't think it's going to mess us up too much. All right, so anyway, Dan attacks Rollins through basically Dan knees TT in the face. So Dan attacks Rollins through Dan knees TT face. Copy paste. And that's pretty much it. You just got to kind of go through that process and do that for all the different shots. And I mean, it really doesn't take too long, especially once you get on a roll. And the more you do it, the more familiar you're going to be with this fight scene. So you're not going to have to reference the beat sheet quite as much, and you're going to kind of be able to hone in on exactly what's going on. And obviously, copy and paste is your friend because that's going to keep things consistent, and it's also going to speed things up for you. So that's pretty much the process. Just give yourself enough information to help you put together the different puzzle pieces in the right order, and it'll make the actual editing process a lot easier. You'll also end up with a better cut since you'll have quicker access to a variety of angles and takes for each part of the fight, which will inevitably help you to choose the best moments to include. Let's take another look at what the finished bin will look like. As you can see, I've got all the shot info, the characters, and the comments entered in. One thing I want to point out is that I tried to keep the wording of similar events and groups of people consistent. For example, I used the copy and paste command a lot. If the shot showed the thugs approaching the couple, I was consistent with how I typed it in. So I wrote thugs approaching couple. The T is capitalized and the words are in exactly that order. If I had written thugs approaching couple on some takes, and then on other takes written walking up to the bad guys, it'd be harder to see in my bin which takes contained the exact same moments, because I'd be calling them different things. Also, it wouldn't allow us to sort our bin by the comments column alphabetically to put all of these similar moments right next to each other. Doing it this way, we again have easier access to the shots that we need, and we can edit more quickly and effectively, which is always our goal. Okay, so there's one last step to this editing preparation process. Now that you have a nicely organized bin, you're going to want to go through the different takes for each section of the fight and just mark down some of your favorites. There's a couple ways that you can do that. You can either color the subclips in your bin to mark them as your favorites, or you can add a new column and label it as a good take. In addition to somehow marking the clip in the bin as a good take, sometimes I also like to place locators or markers on the actual footage to remind myself of exactly where some of my favorite pieces of footage are located. All of this is optional, but it's highly recommended. You can do this as quickly or as thoroughly as you want, but the more carefully you watch each take and mark your favorite stuff, the more likely you're going to be to make sure that you're finding the best material to work with from the shoot. You'll notice as we're cutting the scene together that I'll have some markers and some color coding on the footage that I'm working with to remind me of some of the parts of the footage that I think are worth including in the fight. So in this lesson, we learned some useful bin organization techniques for our fight scene footage. We added 3 custom columns to hold information about the shot, the characters, and the action taking place. We also learned about action bracketing, which allowed us to use the first and the last actions in a take as descriptors in the bin so that we can easily find the part of the fight that we're looking for later on down the road. And last, we talked about marking our favorite takes using clip colors, column information, and markers or locators on the actual footage. At this point, you should go ahead and finish organizing the SC_10 bin with all the different pieces of information that we talked about, and mark up some of your favorite takes. This shouldn't take you too long, and once you're done, you'll have a much easier time in the next few lessons where we begin cutting the fight together. Coming up, we're going to take a look at an overview of the rough editing process. This will be the last study-based lesson in this course, after which everything is going to be hands-on editing. Alright, see you in a bit.